So welcome to the Writers Virtual Craft Chat series, where we talk a little bit less about what the author wrote and a little bit more about how he wrote it. I'm delighted to be here again with Athena Dixon, who has written a memoir and essays, which will just wrap itself around your heart in a good way, not like an octopus's tendrils. The Loneliness Files, a memoir and essays by Athena Dixon. I have so many pages of questions. I will get to yours. Put them all in the chat. It's helpful for middle-aged me if you put the word question ahead of it, in capitals even. It's fine to yell at me. But let's start off, Athena, by read us a bit, please.
Okay. I'll read you a little bit from the opening essay. Say You Will Remember Me. So you just need to know that the book opens on New Year's Eve 2020, headed into New Year's Day 2021. Say You Will Remember Me. I remember loneliness because it is pervasive. It has a way of wrapping itself around me until it hides what's actually true. It squeezes tightly in my mind until what makes sense, what's actually happened, is distorted. Sometimes the loneliness makes me forget the goodness and the connection of my life. I find ways to compartmentalize these experiences until it is easy to remember only what I want. I think alone is sexy, mysterious in its heaviness. Alone seems like a choice. Loneliness doesn't. This seems like I've been forgotten, passed over, discarded. It can feel like the world is way too bright, just an expanse of whiteness with nothing else in sight. It makes me feel singular and small. On the cusp of 2021, in a green dress and red lipstick, I told myself I could cry, one wailing, sobbing mess of a breakdown between sips of liquor, because when I woke up the next morning, the world would appear to be new. This New Year's Eve was only a celebration of a year that needed to end, a year that saw some of us sink into isolation and others delve further into individualism and selfishness. This night was a cap to months of loneliness, a small bit of joy and release before heading into the bleakness of what seem to be the coming year. I checked out of the news months ago, too overwhelmed by death and discord that I felt myself slipping too much into darkness. This cry was a promise to myself that it would wash away the concrete dust and dying dreams of what 2020 could have been. I had a book on the way, and I finally started to find my voice when I'd been so sure I'd lost it. As selfish as my feelings may have been, it just wasn't fair, and I wanted to wallow. I cried and then danced until my body slowed to rocking, and when the countdown ended, the loneliness came in like a wave. My loneliness is not groundbreaking, though, and it is not tragic. It just is, nothing more and nothing less. I don't expect it to be important to anyone other than myself, but I write about it anyway. I turn it over like something precious in my hands, carefully as it floats across my fingers so I can see the details of it, where dust and dirt and grit hide, the things that irritate and choke me when I breathe too deeply. My loneliness is deep. It's oddly comforting because I know what to expect. It's like a light switch, sudden and complete when it rears its head. My body starts to wind down and my mind disengages. Loneliness and isolation have been a slow build of contentment over the years before the sudden revelation of how the two are really a disconnect disguised as choice. How between parents, a sibling, family, and friends is always the fear that I will die alone, that no one will remember me.
Okay, thank you. We're going to start with a standard Writer Center event question, which is, who the heck are you?
I'm Athena. I am the oldest of two children, the daughter of Albert and Sharon Dixon, the older sister of Ivana Bowman. I am a music lover and a very curious woman, and I am a woman currently unpacking and examining different parts of her being in order to make sense of my life.
Okay, so as an essayist, I want to know so many things. So how did this, so this is a memoir in essays. Do you want to just, like, for people who haven't had the pleasure of buying and picking up this book, which you should, and you should write positive reviews, So can you just describe the structure so to orient everybody into what you've created here?
So the book itself is 16 essays, and the book opens on New Year's Eve 2020, headed into 2021, and ends on New Year's Eve 2021, headed into 2022. But that's like the outside vessel of the book. The bulk of the book is split into 3 sections. So the first section is about how my life and how loneliness manifests currently. And then the second section is about how I got to this place of loneliness and disconnection. And then the third section is more about me dissecting going back home and the need to grieve and to reconnect with my lineage. And so the book moves from like very macro views of the world at large down to very, very singular and micro views of the death of my last grandparent and how that triggers this idea of needing to reconnect with my family.
So, so there's an art. So, I mean, for me, when I write an essay, I have a thing I want to say, which is not part of, I mean, it's part of like, you know, the rhythm of my life, but this collection, each essay revolves around a particular thing. I wrote that in the questions, right? It's a thing, right? Like the Truman Show or Old Lang Syne or a woman who sat dead with her TV on for years before everybody noticed. So I want to know both in terms of like time, like how did you do this?
So I wrote the vast majority of the book between March of 2020 and April of 2022. And originally the book wasn't going to be a book. It was just me dissecting my feelings. And so the book started as me being very lonely in this apartment. So if you haven't read the book, part of what comes up in the book is that I live in Philadelphia. So I'm about 378 miles from my family. So I live in the city by myself. I don't have a partner. I don't have any pets. And so I went from being in an office 5 days a week to being in a 2-bedroom apartment by myself during the first wave of COVID lockdowns. And so I'm a kind of shy person by nature, but after those first couple of weeks rolled away, I was like, oh, I'm by myself. And so I started really struggling with being alone and in my apartment being so silent and being so singular. And so I started watching video game walkthroughs on YouTube as a way to have human voices in my apartment. And I watched video game walkthroughs, specifically horror games, because the people would stop and start. There was ambient noise from the games, and it sounded like conversations in the background of an office to me. And because YouTube is YouTube and the algorithm is the algorithm, I started getting recommendations for like,
You might like.
yeah, you might like videos about people who mysteriously disappeared, or the last CCTV video, somebody that disappeared on their way to work. And so it's like all these like true crime videos and mystery videos. And so I fell down this rabbit hole, and that led me to the story of Joyce Carol Vincent, who is the woman I mentioned in the first essay. Joyce was a woman in England. She passed away in 2003. She was in front of her television. She had Christmas gifts wrapped beside her. Nobody found her body until 2006. Television was still on, Christmas gifts still beside her, and she just fell off the face of the earth and died. And so when I came across her story, I said, oh my God, that could be me. Like, I'm in this apartment, triple locked door in the middle of a city. I'm working from home. If I die, it might not take 3 years for my family to realize I'm missing, but it's not going to be immediate. And so I really started thinking, like, how did I make decisions, and how were decisions made for me? What kind of choices led me to this place where I was so isolated that this was a possibility? And so I started writing. And as I started writing, I was focusing mainly on technology at first. And then I started really thinking, what are the different ways that loneliness and disconnection manifest in my life? So that's why you ended up getting essays that talk about me being in a deprivation tank, because I'm trying to disconnect myself from social media and my phone. And that social media addiction is a form of isolation and disconnection. I started writing about things like the Truman Show. And because the algorithm itself is digital isolation, we think that we have choice, we think that we have options, but really we're in these little bubbles that the world is being created around. And so I found these individual things that helped me puzzle out how I made these choices, how I got to this point. And so I just started writing into the curiosity of each one of those things. And by the time I got done, I had these 16 essays. And then I started really kind of shaping them into the book itself.
So, Alicia, I do see your question, and I agree that is a great one. We're going to get to that. I do have that, but I want to get to like how this happened first. And I appreciate your people being like, question, all caps, thank you, middle age, thank you. So, for me, when I write an essay, I have a thing I want to unpack, and it's not necessarily on a trajectory. So when and how did you know that you were writing a collection? How do you create a collection? Did
Um,
you know you were? Was it like, surprise?
it was a little bit of a surprise. So I probably wrote 8 out of the 16 essays before I really thought that I was on to like writing a manuscript, because I was writing in my brain like standalone essays that kind of circled the same thing, but I wasn't thinking about it as a book. I was just trying to puzzle my way through these feelings because it was just a very, very scary time. And so I had no intentions on really writing a book until I got about 50% in, and I was like, oh, this all makes sense. How can I put this together as a book? And that,
We're going to pause here and
yes,
say, how did you put it together as a book?
okay. It came together as a book in many iterations. So originally, once I finished writing the essays, the book was in chronological order, which did not make sense. It was very kind of clunky. It moved back and forth a little bit too much in time to make sense within the individual essays and the essays as a whole. So then I started thinking, how are these essays grouped together? And so that's why you have those 3 sections. You have the first section, which covers the lonely corpses. So Elisa Lamb, Joyce Carol Vincent, Geneva Chambers, and that's like a representation of how my life currently is and my current fears. And then I said, okay, the next group of essays, which feature stuff about fan fiction and the algorithm and all these other ways that loneliness built in my life without me realizing it, things that I was doing to get me to this place. And then the last section were all essays that very much circled around grief and isolation and fear. And so that's how I ended up grouping them. And then I further grouped them by giving them a soundtrack for each section. So that's why at the beginning of each section, there's 3 songs to listen to, because it sets like a sonic landscape. But it really was a matter of shuffling around what essays I thought had the strongest connection, and then figuring out what that connection was between them and how they should be ordered in the book.
So, you had written them all,
Mhm.
and then you had this deck of cards and you were shuffling it around.
Yeah, that's usually how it works with me. I'm a pantser. I know that that's probably a bad thing, but
Can you explain that to people?
yeah, I go in, I write by the seat of my pants, essentially. I go in, I don't have an outline. I chase something down a rabbit hole and I just write it. And then I worry about the formulation of it. I worry about the formatting. I worry about the order after I've written everything. And so that's why in my editorial process, it ends up being like, we cut out like 10,000 words of the book before it came out, because there were essays that were well written. They just didn't fit in the greater scheme of things. So I'm very much a pantser. So I had no thought process until I wrote all the pieces of how they were going to like be ordered and how the book itself was going to come together.
Okay, so you started writing essays to understand what was going on,
Mhm.
and then you were like, oh, this might be a trajectory. And then
Mhm.
you wrote more.
I wrote probably 8 before I thought it was going to be a book, and then I wrote like another 8 after I started thinking it was going to be something. Um, so
So,
like 50%.
so um, this is not your first book.
No.
So do you think that that affected the way that you were like recognized that you had a cohesive thing?
Um, Not necessarily. I refer to my first book now as my selfish book, because that book had a lot less thought in terms of like the connections. That first book I wrote very much like I felt very invisible. That book is called The Incredible Shrinking Woman. And kind of the central themes of that book are about invisibility and voicelessness. And so I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote because I felt like I hadn't been able to speak in so long. And those essays just kind of ended up circling each other. But there was no real forethought about how those essays would connect to the larger world. I didn't really do research for those essays. This collection, the new book, once I kind of got 50% in, and I realized that the curiosity was bringing me to some places that demanded research and a little bit more nuance and a little bit more connection to the world, I started being a lot more conscious and a lot more deliberate in how I put that book together. So they're kind of like on two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of construction and creation.
Okay, so when you were writing the essays, you were aware this could be part of a bigger thing.
After halfway through, yeah.
Question from Navneet, relevant to this, and I am going to get back to the other questions, but were any of the essays published before the book was?
There are 3 essays that are previously published. So the essay Distillation was published in 2021. The essay You Have the Right to Remain Silent was published in 2021. And the very end of the essay Upon My Return was published in 2015, but everything else was new for the book.
Talk about what you mean by a memoir in essays.
Part of that is that I recognize my skill set as a writer doesn't necessarily at this moment include being able to write a traditional arc. I don't think that I probably will ever write a traditional memoir because my brain and the way that I create doesn't lend itself to that. I think that would stifle me to be
Thank
fully.
heavens.
Yeah, so right now I'm not writing towards something like that. So for me, the memoir and essays was, I was looking at it like, even though these are individual pieces, they add up to a moment, a segment, a portion of my life that all circles the same idea. And so that's why it's a memoir. It's just pieced together a little bit differently. And I think that it works stylistically because the book is about loneliness and isolation and disconnection. So you have these like ghosts and these threads between it. But it's just a memoir and essays because my creative process does not lend itself to writing a traditional arc, which I think is fine.
So what time period what time period in your head does the book cover? Because you wrote it during a very particular time.
Yeah, I wrote all the essays during a very particular time, but everything in that book takes place probably roughly over the span of the last 10 years, roughly. From about the first time I wrote a personal essay, which was in 2011, up until 2022. So the vast majority of the stuff happens during the time frame that I've lived here in Philadelphia. I've been in Philadelphia 9 years. So it circles us roughly a decade, but there are some mentions of things that happened before, but the vast majority of everything that I'll talk about happened in the last 9 to 11 years.
So I'm gonna use that to jump into a question from Alicia, which in the chat, which I was gonna get to later, but it feels like a moment to talk about this. So her question is, how do you handle reactions from family or friends when you talk about loneliness? Are they angry? Do they take it personally? Do they pull away from it further as a reaction? Do they have positive reactions? I ask because I struggle to write the things about very personal things, and memoir would be extremely difficult to write for this reason, although I feel that I have a lot of emotional material. So the question is, to boil it down, when you write about an intensely personal thing that refers to other people, as a process, not not necessarily emotionally if you don't want to share that, but like process wise, what do you do?
I can answer both. Emotionally,
Yay!
thankfully for me, my family, the family and friends that in some ways circle the books, last book and this book, have been overwhelmingly positive. If anything, they've been surprised. My dad especially has been very much like, I had no idea that you were going through these things. I had no idea that you were feeling these things, because he's used to me being very much like the older, pulled together daughter who doesn't really express those things. So my family has been very glad that they get to see this other part of myself. I've had a couple friends tell me that they wish they would have reached out to me more during the lockdowns because they didn't realize how lonely that could be, because they were used to being in community with family and friends and children and stuff. So for me, it's been very positive. I haven't had anybody take offense to it, although I was a little bit worried for this book because it's very difficult to tell your family and friends in the world that you feel lonely when you're very much. I talk to my family every single day. We text each other every morning, the four of us. So it's very difficult to kind of explain to people who love you that you feel disconnected. It's difficult to explain to them that it's not for lack of love or connection with them. It's just like something internal that I'm trying to puzzle out myself. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to be with them. It's just like I have this kind of this veil that's always there, and I'm trying to figure out where it comes from and if there's a solution for it, or if I want there to be a solution for it. Creatively, the process of writing something very personal kind of falls in two camps for me. The first thing is I always, before I write anything and put anything into the world, I make a very, very conscious decision if that particular thing that I'm writing is for public consumption. I have a folder called Good Morning Heartache on my laptop that's full of poems and stories and essays that I've written about very personal stuff that I needed to get out of my body and my brain, but I will never submit for the most part. It's very rare that anything makes it from that folder into the real world because it's either full of rage, it's destruction, it's me taking people down, taking myself down. There's no good reason for that work to be in the world, but I need not to hold it in my body. So I make that first determination. Is this something that I'm ready to put into the world? Is it something I'm willing to talk about? Is it something that I'm willing to have to explain to people? Am I willing to hurt myself and other people by putting this into the world? Once I make that determination, I do my best to only write towards or write to people and experiences that I can feel good and or neutral about. And when I say neutral, I mean, I'm not going to make you better or worse than you were. I'm just going to tell you what happened and what my reaction to it was. And if I can say that I'm neutral towards something, then it's okay for me to write it. And neutral not meaning I don't have strong feelings about it, but meaning I've been able to harness my creative thought process enough where I'm not using my platform and my ability to write these words to harm you. I also make a conscious decision to not name people, especially when it's on the neutral side, because I figure if you take offense to it and you want to out yourself as the person that I'm writing about, then that's up to you to out yourself, but I'm not going to name you specifically. And then the last thing is it's very, very rare for me to let people read stuff in advance. There's only been 2 instances where I've let somebody read something in advance of me sending it out into the world. And neither one of them were blood relatives. They were both friends. One of them was because we have a friendship, but our friendship is not public consumption friendship. We don't like tag each other. We don't take pictures together. We're just very, very private friends because he's in a industry and I'm a writer. And so we have a private relationship. And so I wrote something that did not name him, but I wanted him to read it to make sure there was nothing that was going to cross our established boundary of having this like private friendship. And then the second one I let somebody read because he was an attorney. And even though I didn't name him, I did not want him to sue me. And he was fine. He gave me edits. I did not take the edits, but he was okay. But those are the only 2 instances because I make a lot of conscious decision and care before it gets to that point to make sure I'm not purposely harming somebody. But I will say that there's in the book, the essay Distillation is probably the only essay that I've put out recently where I was kind of like, I'm a little worried about my family. And not because I was being purposely harmful, but because it's an unnamed family member who is a high functioning alcoholic. And I didn't want that essay to come off as me being judgmental. As I was really worried when the book came out that my dad in particular would read it and would feel some kind of way about it because he would know immediately who it was about. And fortunately, that hasn't come to bear. But I did my best to remain as neutral as possible, but there's always that little bit of tenderness there for that one.
So, Athena, that's really all really interesting to me. I get a lot of people at the Writers Center where I talk to people who are really concerned about the impact of writing on family, about family or friends, and so I want to know how those concerns impact your writing. So at what point do you share the work? So so is it like someone on your shoulder saying don't write that? Is it someone on your shoulder saying don't publish that? or is it not a don't?
Um, for me, it's a matter of tenderness. I mentioned that something I did a talk last weekend, and I was saying that for me, the determination is if it's tender, like I can touch it and I'm like, oh, it's a little achy, I feel like it's okay to write. But if I touch that memory or I touch that page and I'm like, I'm afraid, like I'm afraid that this is going to cause myself or somebody else harm, then I back away from it. Like there, for me, there's no publication credit, there's no book that is important enough for me to cause myself harm, because I know now firsthand that anything you put into the world, you cannot control how people analyze you or the people that you include. And do you want that to be like forever in the world? Two, you're always going to be asked about this. And if it's something that you're not comfortable talking about, it's something that is going to cause you more harm than good. I would steer clear of it. So I never really get to a point where I have to think about it too much, because I always make that public consumption decision before I write anything for the world. Like,
So do you feel that stifles your, I mean,
no, I don't think it does, because the stuff that I put in the private folder, I still write
oh,
like it's
okay, there we go.
yeah, I just write that like it's a regular essay, but it's just never going to get submitted anywhere. Like the
Okay, so
creativity.
you, at your point in your career, have a clear, this is for me, this is for the world.
Yeah,
Did you have that as an emerging author?
I think so. That folder's existed for like 12 years roughly now.
You're an excellent human.
But I will say there are like the very beginning of my path of writing personal essay. There are some essays where I'm like, I wish I would have taken a little bit more time to develop the heart of them, because I look at them now and I'm like, that was, you were barely containing that emotion. Like you were barely like, this is barely creative writing. This is borderline a diary entry. It's nothing that it's nothing I would take back because I'm ashamed of this in the world, but I wish I would have taken more time in the craft of it. But I was still very new to writing personal essay. But from the very beginning, that folder's been there, because I knew at the time that I came to writing personal essay because my background is a poet. I have a master's degree in poetry. And so I didn't start writing prose until 2011. I was going through a very bad breakup and divorce. And at the time, I couldn't say all the things I needed to say in poetry. So I was like, I'm going to write these personal essays, because if I don't get this anger and this rage and this heartbreak and this depression out of me, I'm not going to survive. And I've been very open with the fact that I had multiple suicide attempts during that time of my life.
Oh,
And I had to get it out. And that's why I started writing personal essay. So I knew from the very beginning, there's stuff that I cannot put, even if it's just to hide these feelings from my family, I cannot put this into the world. So that folder has always existed. And as I've gotten deeper into writing prose, now it exists for those same reasons, but the emotion of it isn't as raw as it was in those first iterations. But it was just like, I'm thankful that I had the forethought to protect myself in that way, because I think that if I would have let some of that stuff out into the world, it would have just been destructive for no reason.
that is really interesting. I'm gonna swing that into a question from the from the chat, from Allie. During the first times when you went back to read everything you wrote, what thoughts or emotions came up? Did it change your perception of anything? So that's, I mean, let's take that a little broader to be like, so you're writing to deal with your feelings. Do you go back to it, to what you wrote, and what's your process there?
I do. I tend to do that while I'm actually crafting, and then after the individual project is over. So I write multiple projects at the same time, because I can't just focus on one project. Part of that is I have been late stage diagnosed with ADHD, and I cannot, like, I time block a lot because I can't focus on one particular thing. And so I write multiple projects. So like I've been writing another collection since October of last year, even while I was in edits and promo and stuff for this book. And I've been writing a fiction project, and I've been writing all these other things. And so I leave whatever I'm working on, work on something else and come back to it to give myself fresh eyes. And it allows me, in this particular instance, allowed me to see that I was kind of skirting some issues. And being a little bit too flowery in the thought process of it, and being a little bit too kind to myself. Not that I'm mean to myself, but I think in the first couple iterations of me writing, I was looking at myself as like this super successful, independent woman who was just having a little bit of like doubt. And then I realized what I was doing was hiding behind this hyper independence, that I was thinking that because I had the ability to move to a city by myself, because I could live a comfortable life and have all these trappings of the success, that I was okay. Now writing the book and going back and reading it as a draft and now as a final book, I'm like, no, that was just me hiding all these things I was afraid to admit, that I'm afraid to die by myself. I'm afraid for people not to remember me. I'm afraid to not have a legacy. And I'm afraid that all the decisions that I made to get to this point are not reversible. And so that's what I really learned about myself at the offset of the draft and the final book.
This is the part where I pause and try not to make this discussion about me, because I have so many things I want to say to you personally. I'm going to go to the chat and say, Ron says, I love your original phrasing, such as referring to Joyce Vincent. She was an oddity dissolving quickly into whisper. How do these gems bubble up in your writing? That was actually a question I had. I have multiple pages bookmarked, and I did dog ear and write, and I would find a phrase and I'd be like, that's good. So how do these gems bubble up? Are you aware that you have gems that bubble up? Because if you're not, I will put them all in the chat for you.
I'll say occasionally. I think part of it is because I come from an open mic spoken word background. And so before I got, I have a master's degree in poetry, but before I even got into my grad program, I was doing like weekly open mics and poetry slams. And I was like heavy into poetry during undergrad. And that was my basis. Like I went into grad school as this open mic poet. And so I was very used to writing for a stage. So knowing when audience reactions would happen and playing with words in a way that sounded good on and off the page. And so I think it's a little bit of my poet showing in that way. I think I'm also very interested in the texture of language. And so when I write and I edit.
Excuse me, what do you mean by the texture of language?
Oh, I was going to say,
okay.
I edit out loud. So I write a paragraph, I read it out loud from the beginning. I add a line, I go back and read it from the beginning. And I do that because I want to hear if there are too many similar word sounds together. I want to make sure there's like a variety of sentence lengths. So if I build this really beautiful image, I don't want to just rush by it with another complex sentence. So I create a hard stop so you have time to like plateau and think about the image that I just put down on the page. I worry about things like phonetic intensives, like how we form the words in our throats. That was my research in grad school. And like, so you could have a word like look, glare, gaze, stare. They're all the same action, but the connotation of that word choice changes what your readers are getting from that particular line. So if I say I looked at you versus I glared at you versus I stared at you. So I think about all those things and how I want to, in some ways, manipulate the page. And that's why some of those phrases pop up, because I really take a lot of time to line level, look at how the words bounce against each other.
It shows. Do you have an audiobook of this?
I'm not reading it, but the audiobook will be out November 28th.
So how did you find a reader? I mean, from what I know, companies give you two choices of readers.
Fortunately for me, when Tin House was approached about doing the audiobook, one of the things they negotiated for me was I got final say on the narrator. And so I went through it's coming out through Tantor Media. So I went through all of their narrators on their website and picked like my top 5. And then I was like, these are who I really want. And they were like, she might not be available. And I'm like, that's who I want. And fortunately for me, she said yes. But they actually negotiated that for me so I could pick who I wanted to read my book.
So just out of a little bit of tangent here, so do you get to work with the audiologist?
No,
No,
I
that's an ear doctor, but
think the production might, the sample's already up, so I think production might be done.
right,
Um,
but did you get to weigh in on that?
mhm. But I picked her very specifically because I liked the tone of her voice and the cadence of her voice, and I listened to all her samples, and I realized she would read it in a way that was kind of like slower and a little bit more, I don't say melancholy in a way. So the sample that I've heard that is available, it sounds pretty good. I mean, audiobooks have to have a certain kind of enunciation anyway to make sure you can understand. I really like the tone of her voice, so I'm pretty pleased with it. But I didn't get to actually hear it while it was in production.
So just one more question on that audiobook tangent. In fiction writing and novels, I know that there are changes in the way people write with an eye toward audiobooks. Like you don't want to have the tags like she said, he said, because it'll be performed.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be Amy asked Athena a penetrating and insightful question, she said.
Mhm.
So you wouldn't put the she said. Was that anywhere in your head, or is that just
I tend to not put a lot of dialogue in my work on purpose.
just like the where's this going? The audiobook, like
Oh, no, I don't even know if they changed anything from the book. Like once I made the final decision about like this is my narrator, it was like kind of hands off. But I don't think that they didn't ask me for any edits. They didn't ask me if I had any changes to the structure of anything. So I don't think that there's been any changes at all.
I mean, I love audiobooks. So I love paper books and I
Yes.
love audiobooks. Don't give me an ebook. Okay, back to the chat. Rana, or I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, says, can you tell us about the long arc of your writing journey? How did your love of writing begin, and how did you hone your craft to begin creating published works? And I'm going to actually twist that question a little bit because I'm not sure that an author's relationship with writing is always love
Mhm.
as much as a compulsion, but
I can see that. Um, I kind of have like a not a winding writing path. I mean, it's existed for the vast majority of my life, I guess, but I've detoured quite a bit. So I had no idea kind of what I wanted to do. I just happened to stumble into teachers telling me that they thought I was a good writer. And I started off writing fiction. I started writing fan fiction when I was a kid, and actually have a suitcase in my office right here, which is all my fan fiction on little notebooks that my parents kept for me for some reason. But I started writing fiction, and around like eighth grade, I had a student teacher, and she taught us poetry one grading period. And she was really, really encouraging. And she was like, "Oh, you write like Emily Dickinson." And I'm like, "I
what?
don't know what that is." I was like,
It's like, really what? Okay, great.
okay.
Thank
So
you.
I was like this super emo later. I wore like black the entire year. And I had an evil eye bracelet. I was very serious. And so she was like very encouraging. So I started writing poetry all the time. And I started really researching like Black poets because I was like, okay, they look like me. So I'm going to find these poets that I can like identify with. And then I got to college and I was on scholarship, full scholarship. And I got to college and I said, okay, I'm going to be a magazine journalism major because that makes sense. And I had a really, really, really bad experience. Like I had some clashes with a professor who essentially did not believe I could write. It told me as much. And so it crushed me. And so I changed my major from magazine journalism to sociology because I didn't want to mess up a full ride. So I was like, I have to get a degree. I'm not going to drop out of college, this free college. Um, so I got a sociology degree and I was like, I'm just not going to write. But thankfully, a friend of mine, a fellow poet named Kelly Harris DeBerry, was really heavily into the poetry scene at that school. And she forced me to go to open mics. She's like, you're going to come to this open mic. You're going to read your work. And by the time she graduated, I had been really, really integrated into the poetry scene, and ended up a year later going back to college a second time and getting a bachelor's degree in English, all the while still doing open mics and freelancing, writing music reviews, album reviews, movie reviews, book reviews, or any outlet that I could. And then she told me to apply to Provincetown, and I applied to Provincetown. I got in for a summer class and met my instructor, who asked me to apply to grad school. Had no intentions of going to grad school. I applied to grad school, earned my master's degree in creative writing, and then became an adjunct. And then promptly stopped writing for several years because as an adjunct, I was just so overwhelmed. I was teaching Comp 101 and Comp 102 Intro to Lit, and it took every creative part of my body out. I could not write my own stuff because I was so wrapped up in 5-paragraph essays. And so I stopped writing for several years, and eventually started applying to workshops. And then I got into VONA, then I got into Callaloo, and then I got into Tin House's winter workshop, and eventually applied for Tin House's second book residency. And between those 2017 and 2021, I ended up writing a book and a half, essentially. But it was kind of like I stopped writing for a very long time. At one point between like 2018 and end of 2019, all I was writing was Black Panther fan fiction, because I just couldn't write anything else. And so I found a community there and it kept me writing. But it really was like I had been told in so many ways that I couldn't write. I had been told that I didn't have any soul in my writing. I had been told that my writing would not sell because they couldn't shelve me as a Black writer only, that my books would have to be essentially perfect in order to be picked up. I don't have an agent. I've been rejected I don't know how many times by agents. And so it's been this weird road that ended up with these 2 books.
The power of professors and instructors and gatekeepers who crush our souls. I see this not just with writers, I see this with my kids. I see when people say these dismissive things that they don't even remember, they don't even mean, but we take them and internalize them. I just hope that you will email me these people's names and I will, okay.
I mean, I guess the only good thing is that like it was a roundabout way, but I got back to it. It took me longer to get there. But I think that's why one of the reasons why, even in times where I'm like really swamped and overwhelmed, or I feel like I just cannot do one more thing, if somebody asks me a writing related question or I get an email about something, I'm very, very open to those questions because I know what it's like to be dismissed or to be told that like you're not good enough, or I don't have the time to answer this question. So I try to to make up for those kind of experiences. I try to be as accommodating and open as possible because I know how that one off comment that I may never remember could just change somebody's whole writing path. And
right, but why don't those? This is a story for another day. But why do we just just absorb those negative comments that reverberate for years, decades, as opposed to the compliments, which don't last quite as long? So, Patrice asks, are there any exercises or writing practices that you employ to explore content, recall history, and access memories that are included in your essays? And I'd like to fold that into a question just generally. I think people really want to know, like, what's your day-to-day writing process, right? Because there are people who are like, I write 250 words every day, I write 1,000 words every day. Like, I don't write unless I feel like it. So what's your process?
I have a full-time day job. I have worked for a large federal agency for 15 years. And so my day between roughly 7 to 3:30 every day is me sitting in a cubicle or here in the office, in my home office, unless I'm hybrid right now, not fully home, not fully at work. So all of my writing for the most part takes place after work and on Saturday, because Sunday is usually my reset day where I clean and strip down my beds and stuff. So I really have a couple of hours Monday through Friday and Saturday to write, to edit, to do everything in my creative life. So on those days when I'm actually trying to create something, I've learned very much to give myself the grace to not write every day. I do not write every day because sometimes I don't have the mental capacity to write. And so those are the days that I input versus output. So I'm listening to my playlist. I create playlists for everything. Like I have playlists for individual people and individual essays, for books as a whole. So
Wow.
like there's an essay for
Give me a mixtape, Athena. I want a mixtape.
there's a Spotify playlist for the Loneliness Files. It's like 4 hours long. There's a one for the Incredible Shrinking Woman. There's one for the book that I'm working on now. So that's how I kind of like on the days that I'm inputting, I'm listening to music, I'm watching documentaries, I'm watching random YouTube videos as a way, even if it's like just skirting the ideas that I'm thinking about, just as a way to putting that kind of creative energy into my body and also giving myself the grace to know I don't have to output every day. Like I have to have something to pull from. On the days that I do write, unless I'm in one of my writing groups where we have like accountability, like I have a writing group where we meet on Zoom, turn cameras off and write for 2 hours, usually on Mondays and Wednesdays. And we will say at the beginning, like, I'm going to work on XYZ. And then we check in and then we'll go off camera again and we'll check in at the end. Unless I'm doing something like that, I don't set word goals for the day. I figure if I get anything down, it's good. And again, that's because I have finite time and I want to be kind to myself and realize that it's not like this race to get something done. And then there's the days where I'm not writing or inputting and I'm editing. I do developmental editing and sensitivity reading. So there's some days that my whole creative life exists around other people's work and I'm editing their work and I'm writing responses to their work. And I guess that's to say, part of that balance that exists for me between inputting, outputting, and working on other people's work is because I had a very honest conversation with myself about what I wanted my writing life to look like. And I knew based on the energy that I had, the day job that I have, that it wasn't feasible for me to live a traditional, well, I take traditional in quotes because there is no traditional writer's life.
No.
That was not feasible for me. That I can't get up and do morning pages because I already get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I got to go to a full-time job. So I can't get up at 4 and write. I know I can't come home every night and decompress enough to write. So I just give myself grace to do something creative every day, but not have to output something every day. And then in terms of accessing memories, I am a pack rat. This door behind me, you can't really see all of the stuff on it, but that's like my version of a whiteboard. So I'm working on a new book. So there's like random Post-it notes. There's a picture of me as a kid. I'd like magpie everything. Like I have a folder on my phone called writing inspo. So if I come across a social media post, if I come across something that gives me a jog of memory, I screenshot it. I keep it in this folder. I have boxes of pictures all over my office that I'm looking at just to jog my memory about things that I want to write about. So my accessing my memories is very physical because I know that I can't remember a lot. I know that memory is so fluid that I want to have some tangible reminder of it. So I use those things as a way to sink into what I want to write. And then I write around that. But I'm really like a person who has to have like scraps of paper and pictures and songs and even smells, like and like physical objects. Like my mom used to keep a red makeup sponge in her purse. I don't wear makeup except for lipstick. And I bought it so I could have it and I could touch it and remember, because I'm writing about beauty in this new book. And I wanted that physical reminder that makes me think of my mom putting makeup on. So I do stuff like that to jog my memory enough that I can write.
I'm going to jump to Scott, who shares that their family doesn't quite understand their level of solo lockdown level of loneliness. And for me personally, I feel like my brain sort of folded in that time, and I can't even understand how many days were so the same. But this is so. Scott says, I live vicariously through YouTube as well during lockdown and since. Do you have a favorite channel or genre of video currently? So this goes to the question of what's the input, I guess.
Yeah. So my YouTube right now is this weird mix of YouTube DJs who are doing like mixes of like world music. Like I time block on my Instagram stories a lot, so I'll put up playlists of like different like world music for people can time block with me. So it's a lot of internet DJs. So like Bobby Senga does a really, really good mixes from all kinds of different decades. There's another YouTube DJ named Isaac. I cannot pronounce his last name. Does really, really, really good 3-hour mixes that I put on while I'm working. And then the other side of my YouTube is lots of videos by top 5 unknowns, which are like these little videos about mysterious disappearances and weird occurrences and stuff. So that channel, there's a channel called Slapped Ham that comes up a lot, which is another mystery video channel. And then another channel that is about like disasters that have happened, like in 1945, this boat blew up. Let's dissect how this happened, those kind of things. But Slapped Ham, top 5 unknowns are my top mystery videos. And then Bobby Senga and Isaac are my other side, which are all my music videos.
I'm going to jump to, sorry, just 3-hour playlist.
Yes.
I need to make more use of my Spotify account. Dominique says, I would love to hear how you got out of adjuncting. Did you apply for workshops? Did applying for workshops get you out of the field? I'm currently an adjunct and I'm so drained from the workload and lack of respect comes with a job. And many thanks for the great chat. You're welcome. And I don't know much about adjuncting, so I would like what why is that disrespected? What's going on there?
I will say adjuncting, I can't see much difference now. There's no union, there's no benefits. You get like the bottom of the barrel classes after all the full-time faculty take what classes they want. You get like I think my last year teaching, I had like 120 students, of course, just like across like maybe 3 courses. It's like you get like, you don't have respect. You're not respected like you would if you were like an instructor or an assistant professor, but you have the same educational background. You just don't have the experience to get those positions. And so you could be offered a class, but if another instructor or professor comes in and says, oh, I want that, then you don't have that.
I had no idea.
You get paid like once a month if you're lucky, maybe twice a month if depending on the university. The pay rates are abysmal. I think I taught at 3 schools in South Jersey and I made less than $20,000 the last year that I taught.
So wait, so is this a stepping stone? Is this why?
I mean, I know a couple of people who have gone from adjuncting up into instructor positions and then started applying for assistant professor positions, but I don't know many. I don't. I got out of adjuncting, unfortunately, into my current job. I left adjuncting and went into federal service because the money was so much better. That's another trap of its own. But I was so discouraged by the time that I left that I just stopped teaching altogether because I was just so burned out and so disillusioned that I felt like I would never have a chance to teach any kind of creative writing, that I was always going to be teaching Comp 101 and Intro to Lit. And it was just really, really discouraging. So unfortunately, I just left that structure and went to a kind of an even worse structure with better money, which is the federal government.
I think I have so many things I want to talk to you about. And we are running low on time. So I have 2 wrap-up questions, 3 wrap-up questions. How fast should we do this rapid fire?
Okay.
Okay. Path to publication. A question that nobody's asked you that you'd like us to ask you, and piece of advice for writers just starting out. Boom, boom, boom. Path to publication. Go.
Path publication, me submitting to individual journals and magazines at a very specific rate, being very selective where I set my work in order to get the better publication credits. Nobody ever asked me what my dream publication goal is, and that is to write a Jabari-based novel for Marvel.
Ooh!
And 3, writer's advice, stay 100% true to your voice, because the audience that you need to find who are going to be the most supportive of you are going to be the people who resonate with you, not because you're writing what is popular, trendy, or what is currently selling. Like, your audience will find you if you write in your own voice. And also have a writing plan. Don't assume that the traditional writing success plan that we told has to happen. You can do a lot of stuff if you're very clear about what you expect from your writing career.
What do you mean by that? That
Meaning,
was a beautiful wrap up, but that was
yeah,
too compelling, too compelling for me to not ask for more.
I just mean, like, if you're a writer who knows that you write hybrid work, or you write work that would be best suited for an indie press, don't kill yourself trying to get on the big 5 if you know that that's never going to happen, because they don't think that you're going to be able to be sellable. So find the places that your work fits, and those people where your work fit, they will go to bat for you. Like, they will make sure that you have the same advantages and you get more hands-on treatment. If you know that you need a certain level of income, writing full-time probably isn't going to work, because writers don't make a lot of money. So do you want to do writing and editing? Have a very clear picture of what your writing success looks like outside of what you're told it should be by the industry at large.
And that's a wrap. Emily, if you're here, oh, there we go. Buy the book, buy the book, buy the book, and then send me an email and say, thank you, Amy, for recommending this amazing book. All right.
Thank you for having me.